Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that I would do another career review video. I just think that these videos are very interesting. I get to tell my experiences on, these fighters and how many times I've seen them fight and what fights I've seen them fight in and what I personally thought about them over the years. So, this is just a video where I tell my personal stories and my personal experiences on a fighter, and hopefully you guys enjoy these videos. If you do, click that thumbs up. I would appreciate that very much. Also, if you want me to do more career review videos, on certain fighters, let me know of any recommendations you guys would like, when it comes down to it, and I'll try to, get them out there if I know enough about the fighters. So it is what it is. But anyway, today we're going to do a career review over Saul Canelo Alvarez, a person that is now, in my opinion, the number one pound for pound boxer in the whole entire world in all the sport of boxing today, which is phenomenal because Canelo Alvarez has really grown up as a very great fighter. Not just a great fighter, all-time great fighter. Canelo Alvarez is, a certain amount of people are already debating him as the greatest Mexican fighter already. I thought it was going to be very hard for someone to surpass Julio Cesar Chavez, but man, Canelo Alvarez, he's really done his work. He's really done his business. So it is what it is. Anyways, let's just get into it. So first, I think I should talk about how I first got to know Canelo Alvarez, and then I'm going to go into the first fight that I seen him in. I grew up watching boxing in the 2010s. That's really when I got into sports, and I'm only 23 years old. For those of you guys that don't know, which you probably wouldn't because I've never said that on here before, but when it comes down to the overall bottom line is this: I'm still pretty decently young, and I've only watched boxing for about the past 10 years when it comes down to it. And Saul Canelo Alvarez was still one of the names on the come up. But I started off watching boxing by watching Mike Tyson and watching Muhammad Ali, those older fighters, and I was not interested really in watching anybody else. But I said, well, you know what? I've become obsessed with this sport. I fell in love with this sport. I've done, a lot of research on this sport. I think it's time for me to get even more enjoyment out of it because I just keep rewatching the same old fights and a certain amount of other things. Maybe I should watch some of the current age boxers. And one of the current age boxers that I had heard about years ago was Floyd Mayweather Jr. And the other one that was very popular is Manny Pacquiao. I heard about both of these guys all the time. So I looked at Floyd Mayweather Jr. and I seen what his next fight was. And by this time, the first the first pay per view that we ever got for a boxing match was Floyd Mayweather Jr. versus Marcos Maidana, which, looking at it, I thought that was actually a very decently close fight. I have to rewatch it because I haven't rewatched that fight in years. But when it comes down to it, when I first watched that fight, I thought it was extremely close. But I'll have to rewatch it. But when it comes down to it, Floyd Mayweather, I looked at it, he was still undefeated, and I said, wow, this guy, all these years, even years ago when I seen him, top of the game, still today, top of the game. And if you bought pay-per-views at the time, you knew that they do this thing to where they might still do this, but I'm not sure if they do, where if you're going to buy a pay-per-view fight, especially with a very decently popular fighter, they kind of have these free on-demand fights to kind of get you into the pay-per-view to where they show some of their past fights now. They still do this where like they'll televise it on Showtime or maybe on ESPN or something, like if Terrence Crawford is going to fight or something like that, but they don't necessarily do it the same. So Floyd Mayweather, with his upcoming fight against Marcos Maidana. And I said, okay, well, let's see how good Floyd is or whatever. This is what I said. And Miguel Cotto, I seen that fight against Miguel Cotto. I thought that he looked pretty damn good in that fight. And he looked even better in another fight that I seen him in, and I was against Canelo Alvarez. And I looked at Canelo Alvarez, and I heard about Miguel Cotto. I heard about, a lot of those guys. I heard about Ricky Hatton. I heard about Miguel Cotto. I heard about Manny Pacquiao, those guys. I said, wow, Floyd is able to beat these guys. That's pretty damn good. But Canelo, I had not heard of before. He was a little bit of a new kid on the block. And I believe at the time when him and Floyd had faced, I think Canelo was like 23 years old when it came down to it. So, so the upcoming kid. And I was like, okay, well, he didn't look overly impressive in this fight. I thought Floyd clearly won the fight, but Canelo, he looks like he has some skills to him. So we'll see what he's able to do. So the first Canelo fights that I seen were the Austin Trout fight and the Mayweather fight. Now, I did not watch those fights the exact day that they happened. The first live pay-per-view that I had ever seen of Canelo Alvarez, and you gotta understand, and let's go back all the way to it now. Now we're gonna go do his professional boxing record. So this was years ago. Okay, so I seen highlights of the Josesito Lopez fight. Completely destroyed him, and I knew Josesito Lopez because of course, the Mayweather-Maidana fight was coming up, and I had seen the Maidana-Josesito Lopez fight, and I said Maidana looked pretty impressive in that. And, Canelo Alvarez, he pretty much dominated Josesito Lopez, so is what it is. And I believe, actually, Canelo was supposed to fight Victor Ortiz, but Victor Ortiz ended up getting his jaw broken. He was upset in that fight against Josesito Lopez, so that's what happened there. But when it comes down to it, so he completely squashes Josesito Lopez, goes to fight undefeated Austin Trout, who has, an undefeated streak in his career. He's undefeated at the time. Just recently beat Miguel Cotto. And Miguel Cotto that I believe was coming off of a loss to Floyd Mayweather. But overall, still a Cotto that was at a decent point in his career. So very impressive to beat Miguel Cotto, even though I don't think Cotto is really the greatest at that division. It's not that he's not an all-time great fighter. Cotto is an all-time great fighter. It's just Cotto is an all-time great fighter. It's just unfortunate that he doesn't really have the reach and the height to kind of compete with some of those lengthier boxers at the 154-pound division and at the 160-pound divisions. So it is what it is. But when it comes down to it, I seen the Austin Trout fight. I thought Canelo looked pretty impressive there, but it was pretty decently close. And a certain amount of people may forget, but they were saying that Canelo Alvarez, got a bad decision in this Austin Trout fight, man. They said overall that Austin Trout got robbed in the fight. I remember a certain amount of boxing channels saying that. So I was like, well, we'll see how he looks in this next fight. And then I seen the Floyd Mayweather Jr. one. Of course, this is his first loss when it comes down to it. And I didn't think he looked that impressive. I missed the Alfredo Ngulu fight when it came down to it, but I watched the highlights and I thought he looked decently impressive. But the first fight ever that I seen of Canelo Alvarez on pay-per-view, and first fight live that I ever seen about Canelo Alvarez, was Arislandi Lara. And if you look at this from my perspective, listen, I'm gonna admit this straight up. In these years, I was in more of a fanboy stage. I always say on my channel now that it's not a good thing to be a fanboy. It's not a good thing to be a fan of these fighters. So you try to stay logical and objective. But I was in my teenage years at this time, so I was a certain fan of certain fighters like Miguel Cotto. I was a big fan of him. I was a big fan of a certain amount of other fighters. And Canelo, when I took a look at him, I actually like Canelo. And Lara coming in, I think his record was like 19-1 or something like that. He was coming in, he had one loss. He didn't have that many fights in his record. But of course, I'm kind of looking at this two-dimensionally. I'm not really looking at it like, I'm not really looking at it with great coverage. So I'm thinking, well, you know what? Lara doesn't have that many fights on his record. He already has one loss. Canelo Alvarez, he's fought some of the best out there. He's beat Austin Trout. He fought Floyd Mayweather Jr. How good can this Lara guy be? Well, come to figure out, Lara was extremely good. Lara wasn't even just very good. He was great. And looking at that fight, we did buy it on pay-per-view. I almost did not buy the fight on pay-per-view. And that is important to mention because there was an uproar after this fight from a certain amount of people to where they thought Lara won the fight. And I would have not believed them had I not got this pay-per-view. But when it came down to it, I remember getting the fight. And I remember looking at, my father actually won the day before the fight, excuse me, stuttering a little bit. But my father, the day before the fight, what he wanted to do, he's like, well, you know what, let's check out some Lara highlights. Let's see how good this guy is. And I was like, we're going to see him tomorrow. I don't think he's going to have that much of a chance, whatever. Well, heading into the fight, when it comes to the pay-per-view, first few rounds, I think Lara's doing really good. I think he's doing really good. I think he's sticking his jab out there. I think he's moving from side to side. He's moving from certain angles. He looks defensively responsible. I think Lara takes the first 3 rounds when it comes down to it. Then it comes to the middle point of the fight. I still think Lara's winning this fight. I think that, in all honesty, I'm like, well, you know what, Canelo, he's gonna turn on soon, and I think like, around the fourth round, excuse me, I think around the fourth round, Canelo starts to turn up the tempo a little bit. So I'm like, okay, Canelo's gonna knock him out. He's gonna stop him. Because once again, I didn't know that much about Lara, and then coming in, it gets to the seventh, eighth, ninth round, and Canelo's picking up the tempo a little bit. But I'm like, I still think Lara's just edging it out a little bit. And when it comes down, I still think Lara looks good. He obviously slows down a little bit, so Canelo's able to hit him with some body shots. He's able to trap him in the corner here and there. But from what I remember the first time watching it, I was like, a lot of these punches, they just don't seem like they're landing. A lot of them just seem like they're landing on the elbows. They seem like they're landing on the shoulders. They seem like they're landing in the kidneys. Like, these aren't impactful punches. These aren't not the punches that overall, in my opinion, count. And a certain amount of people, they may disagree, but that's the way that I remember seeing it. And when it comes to that final bell, I'm like, wow, I think Canelo Alvarez just suffered the second loss of his career. And let me tell you this, when I rewatched that fight today, I have not rewatched that fight in quite a while. Let me tell you this, I still personally believe that Aristani Lara won that fight, and a certain amount of people may disagree with me. There's, of course, going to be a lot of people, and the Mexican fan base especially, that'll say that Lara ran too much. I personally believe that Aristani Lara won that fight. I personally think you can argue that it was 7 rounds to 5, or maybe even 8 rounds to 4 for Lara, and a certain amount of people may disagree. Now, once again, I'll have to rewatch that fight completely today, because I score fights differently today than what I did back then. So it is what it is. But when it comes down to it, you certainly can argue that Lara maybe could have threw a little bit more. In my opinion, I thought Lara landed the more impactful punches, usually the cleaner punches. And in my opinion, I thought Lara won that fight. I thought he won the fight, and I still stand by that statement today. So this was really the reason why I hated Canelo Alvarez for such a long time. And once again, I'm not in a fanboy stage anymore to where I love fighters or hate them anymore. I don't do that anymore, because I've learned over time, especially as I've gotten older, that it's best to be logical and objective. But man, I remember that decision. I remember hearing one scorecard for Canelo, and when the fight ended at the time, I thought maybe it could have been a draw. So I said, okay, this is a close fight. If it goes to Canelo by a little bit, I wouldn't be upset, but I think it's going to go to Lara. And I heard one scorecard, I think it was 7 rounds to 5 for Canelo, and I said, okay, whatever. And then I heard another one, I think it was 7 rounds to 5 for Lara, and I'm like, yep, that sounds right. And then I hear this 9 rounds to 3 card. And I'm like, that's a little bit interesting, but I think it's going to go to Lara. And they said Canelo Alvarez. And to be honest, I think that that's one of the worst scorecards that I've seen to this day. I think that is one of the worst, and pretty much everyone said that at the time, besides, of course, the Mexican fan base, but it is what it is. But that was one of the worst scorecards. And by the way, that's not the only time I've seen that judge score like that. For some reason, he has not been suspended or expelled to ever judge a boxing fight again, because that's not the only time I've seen him judge a bad fight. That judge never scores fights correctly. He's a very bad judge. I don't think that he's a good judge at all. I've seen him in at least 3 separate occasions. People complain about his scoring. I believe he even scored the Scott Quigg over Carl Frampton at one point in time when they fought. So you can go ahead and look that up. I believe that was the same judge. But when it comes down to it, I was like, wow, I think Lara just got robbed. And there was a bunch of people overall in an uproar. There was a bunch of people saying Lara got robbed. There was a bunch of people saying that Lara ran too much. When I look at it today, you certainly could argue that Lara could have threw more, but in my opinion, I still would give Lara that fight. And I think it's unfortunate, because Lara and a lot of these Cuban fighters, they don't necessarily get the respect that they deserve. So it is what it is, but, it's unfortunate. And I've always said this about Lara, and I still stand by the statement today. You can argue that Lara has not lost a fight in his career. And a certain amount of people may disagree with that, but it is what it is. Because personally, even that fight he lost against Jarrett Hurd, I would have scored it personally for Lara. But it is what it is. But Lara does not attract a certain amount of the fan base, so he's not usually going to get the decision in those close fights, unfortunately. So it is what it is. But after this, man, I just thought Canelo looked so bad in that fight. He looked like such a one-dimensional fighter. He looked like he had brick feet. He looked like he was very one-dimensional. He didn't look like he had that great amount of movement to me. And I had this opinion of Canelo Alvarez for such a long time that he really wasn't that good of a fighter because I seen him against Mayweather. I thought he got completely dominated. And there were some other fighters that gave him, a hell of a much more tough time than Canelo Alvarez did. And when it came down to it, I seen him against Lara, this guy that was like 19-1, and I said, well, how good is this Canelo Alvarez guy? How good is he really? I don't think he's that good. And that was my opinion of him for several years when it came down to it, or maybe not several, but for quite a bit of time. So it is what it is. So we have this next fight against James Kirkland. And at the time, this is when they're kind of trying to build up the Canelo Alvarez versus Miguel Cotto fight, because I believe in that same year, if it wasn't in, I think it was that same year in 2014, Miguel Cotto ends up beating Sergio Martinez, I think for the WBC middleweight title. I think it's for the WBC middleweight title. But he ends up dominating Sergio Martinez. Very impressive performance by Miguel Cotto. So they're trying to build up that fight, from now on. Miguel Cotto looks renewed with Freddie Roach and a certain amount of other things. Well, for Canelo Alvarez's next fight, he's fighting a guy that is coming in a comeback fight against, James Kirkland. James Kirkland, he used to work with Ann Wolfe, who is a former female professional boxer, a lot of power. If you know boxing for quite a while, then you've heard of Ann Wolfe. James Kirkland, I didn't really know a great amount about him, but I seen that he was able to knock out Alfredo Ngulu. He was able to knock out, I think this guy's name is Glenn Tapia. And Glenn Tapia, in that division, he used to be a decent fighter. So I said, okay, well, this guy has a decent amount of power. This guy, he's not too bad. He's defeated some fighters, knocked him out even earlier than Canelo Alvarez was able to. He knocked out Alfredo Ngulu earlier than what Canelo Alvarez was able to, I believe. So, it was very impressive. So I said, this guy has a lot of power. If he's able to take him late, then he could possibly do something to Canelo Alvarez. But I remember this fight, and I think James Kirkland was able to hit Canelo Alvarez a certain amount of times. But Canelo, he was cool as a cucumber. He basically was able to withstand that pressure. He was able to basically withstand all of his attacks, and he was able to lean up against the ropes and wait for James Kirkland to be wide open straight down the middle, because he usually is. James Kirkland also does not have a very good shin. And that's overall a big thing in this fight. And James Kirkland ends up getting knocked out within 3 rounds. I can't remember how many times he got knocked down in the first round. I think maybe once, and then second round maybe once or twice. Once I think. He gets caught with uppercuts straight down the middle. He gets caught with certain things up the middle because he doesn't have that great of a chin. And when it comes down to it, he's just very straightforward. He doesn't really move his head around a whole lot. He doesn't really cover up a great amount. He's just constant pressure. And that's really all he had in the fight. And Canelo Alvarez was able to defensively withstand that. And he was able to come back at him and he was able to knock him out. And I remember that knockout in the 3rd round. Everyone thought that James Kirkland had died. They thought that James Kirkland was going to need a tombstone after that knockout had happened, because that was one hell of a knockout. Everyone thought that James Kirkland was in huge trouble. Of course, eventually he ended up being okay, but I think maybe that might have even been knockout of the year. It was crazy, but I remember that fight, and then there was talks about Canelo Alvarez and Miguel Cotto, getting in the fight or getting a fight. So then, next fight comes between Miguel Cotto and Canelo Alvarez. And I predicted Miguel Cotto to win this fight because I thought Miguel Cotto looked pretty damn good. I thought that he was a better mover than Canelo Alvarez. I thought that he had a decent amount of power. And Miguel Cotto was the type of fighter that I thought it was going to take to possibly beat a Canelo Alvarez, to maybe go to the body of Canelo Alvarez, to jab him a lot, because Miguel Cotto has an excellent jab. Cotto, in my opinion, is one of the all-time underrated boxers. A certain amount of people always say that Miguel Cotto was this great brawler and that he was a true warrior. Miguel Cotto, he can box your ears off if you're a one-dimensional fighter. Miguel Cotto even gave Manny Pacquiao in those early rounds a little bit of trouble. He gave Floyd Mayweather a very tough fight in their fight, and you can't always say that about opponents of Floyd Mayweather Jr. And he gave Canelo Alvarez his problems, and I was in denial because I was such a big Miguel Cotto fan. I was in denial about this fight for a long time, but the truth is about this fight, Cotto just wasn't able to get anything in there, man. He wasn't able to get anything in there. Now, if you rewatch the fight, Cotto actually, if you want to talk about total punches, he might have even landed more punches than Canelo. And a certain amount of people, they may disagree with that. But Cotto's punches were just nowhere near as impactful as Canelo Alvarez's. And that's what the problem was. For every, couple, maybe even 2 or 3 little pit-pat punches that Miguel Cotto was, landing or trying to land, and a lot of them were not landing clearly. So you certainly could argue that Canelo actually, all in all, did land more punches. Canelo Alvarez was able to basically hit him with power shots, and he was pretty much in charge of this fight. It was probably an 8 rounds to 4 fight. I'd have to rewatch this fight when it comes down, and I have to rewatch it. But Canelo Alvarez ended up getting this fight. I had no problem with that when it came down to it. I mean, of course, once again, I was in denial of it at first, but looking at it today, I have no problem with Canelo Alvarez getting the decision. But man, this just made me hate Canelo Alvarez more because I was like, man, that fight was a lot closer than what they scored it, and a certain amount of other things. But and of course, certain people, especially you hear the LDBC and new media today, they love to say now that Cotto was old and a certain amount of other things. He was older, but the truth is that Cotto was he was a pretty decent fighter here, and he tried against Canelo Alvarez, man. He really did, but Canelo not only showed that he's bigger than Miguel Cotto, a decent amount bigger, but he showed overall that he probably does have more of a skill set than Miguel Cotto, and that's saying a lot because Miguel Cotto is an A-class fighter. I think he's always been an A-class fighter, so that is something overall to where, it's still very impressive. But unfortunately for Cotto, one thing I will say is this. I don't think Cotto is really a natural middleweight. I don't think that he's really a natural junior middleweight. I think he's a natural welterweight. But Cotto was so great that, even against Canelo Alvarez and a certain amount of those other fighters at 154 and 160, he was still able to give them problems because he was such an excellent boxer. But it is what it is. But Cotto's not really, in that natural weight class. I think that was one of his biggest problems. But not only that, man, Canelo Alvarez was just able to box Cotto's ears off. That's really the main thing. Canelo he had a great performance in this fight. And this is when I kind of started seeing Canelo Alvarez evolve a little bit as a fighter, but I didn't want to admit it at the time. So this next fight was against Amir Khan. And this is when the Gennady Golovkin and Canelo Alvarez fight, this is when it kind of starts getting in talks. And a certain amount of people are alleging that, Canelo Alvarez is afraid of Gennady Golovkin. And in my opinion, Canelo was kind of avoiding that fight a little bit. In my opinion, he kind of was for a little bit, to the point to where finally the fight happened because they just, couldn't deny Golovkin anymore. And everyone at the time, including me, thought that Golovkin was just going to knock Canelo Alvarez out into next week. And we'll talk about that once the fight comes. But I remember the fight, against Amir Khan. And Amir Khan is probably a natural welterweight. Some would even say 140-pounder. So I think most likely everyone predicted that Amir Khan was probably going to lose this fight. But once again, I did not like Canelo Alvarez at all at this point in time. Amir Khan actually was one of the first boxers that I had seen when I started watching current age boxing. And I said, I think Amir Khan, he has a real chance in this fight. And I think Canelo, eventually will knock him out. But I do think that Amir Khan has more skills than Canelo Alvarez. Well, now looking at it when it comes down to it, once again, I was in my teen years here. So, when it comes down to it, I didn't know much about boxing then as much as I do now. But when it comes down to it, I was in major denial. I said, Amir Khan, man, I think he's going to get beat, but, I think he has more skills than Canelo Alvarez. He really can give him some problems. Well, in the fight pretty much went down like I predicted. Amir Khan, I think he gave Canelo Alvarez problems within the first 2 to 3 rounds. You can even argue that Amir Khan was winning the first 2 or 3 rounds. I think he certainly won the first 2. Third round is a toss-up, but then 4 or 5, Canelo started timing him a little bit more. He started going to the body, and you can clearly tell that Canelo Alvarez was starting to adjust. And Amir Khan, he just kind of has a problem with adjusting. I would not necessarily call Amir Khan a multi-dimensional fighter. Now, he still is a very decent fighter, but when it comes down to it, I would not say that Amir Khan is a 100% multi-dimensional fighter, and he certainly is not the greatest defensively, so it is what it is. But when it comes down to it, man, I remember that knockout that Canelo Alvarez had over Amir Khan in the 6th round, and I thought Amir Khan was trying to move around him decently, but he was starting to get timed And, he was taking, Amir Khan does take a lot of flack for not having that good of a chin, and I agree, he does not have that good of a chin, but he was taking some very good left-hand shots from Canelo Alvarez in this fight. That's what a certain amount of people may not remember. But when Canelo Alvarez hit him with that right hand in the sixth round, oh man, it was all over. It was, I remember seeing that right hand, it landed on Amir Khan, and I was like, and it's over. It's over. I knew it was over. And I'm pretty sure almost everyone else did too. Amir Khan completely folded like a lawn chair, man. He was on the ground. He was completely out of it, completely unconscious. And that might have been another candidate for knockout of the year, man. That was crazy. And I'm not sure if Amir Khan was ever the same after that. Amir Khan certainly has never been the same, especially after that Terrence Crawford fight. But you can argue that Amir Khan was never the same after this Canelo Alvarez fight. So it is what it is. Whatever. But very impressive knockout by Canelo Alvarez. I think he handled Amir Khan's speed pretty well after a while. But I remember that fight. It was pretty crazy. Now, this next fight against Liam Smith, when I took a look at Liam Smith, and I thought that this fight would be interesting because Liam Smith was a bit bigger than Canelo, and this is at the time when I was thinking, well, I don't know if Canelo Alvarez can really handle fighters that are bigger than him. We'll see how he handles someone that's usually bigger than him, or a little bit better than him when it comes down to it. Or not better than him, excuse me, but that's a good fighter, but that's maybe a little bit bigger than him. We'll see how he handles that. Because once again, I still did not like Canelo Alvarez at this point, and when it came down to it, I said, well, Liam Smith has a real chance here. We'll see what happens. Well, I actually did not buy this fight on pay-per-view. We did not get it because even though I thought Liam Smith might have a slight chance, I didn't think that it was a good enough card to get. My parents they didn't get it for me when it came down to it. So I think I seen the highlights for this the next day, and Liam Smith got completely dominated in this fight. And one thing I did not expect was for Canelo Alvarez to knock him out, and with a left-hand shot to the body especially, because one thing I had always said about Canelo Alvarez is that even though he is decently powerful, it's mainly his right hand that you got to worry about, and not usually his left. Now, I still do think that holds up a little bit today because Canelo does not have as powerful of a left hand as he does a right. But when it comes down to it, it certainly has been shown over time that you don't want to 100% take that left hand. It can do some damage. So, it is what it is. Liam Smith, man. And, especially after this fight, I've never been overly impressed with Liam Smith. And now looking at it, with, of course, hindsight, Liam Smith was never really that good of a fighter. He's very one-dimensional, very straightforward, not great movement. Just another one of those regular, British fighters that might come out of there here and there. Dime a dozen that come from Britain. And Britain does come out with some very great fighters. Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua. I think Billy Joe Saunders is a great fighter. Kell Brook was a decent fighter for his day. Even Amir Khan was decent. But Liam Smith just looks like one of those regular British boys that come out from there and, just very one-dimensional. And I was not overly impressed with him. Kind of reminded me a little bit of a Ricky Burns or something, even though Ricky Burns was probably a better boxer than him. But y'all know what I mean when it comes down to it anyway. But, that happened. And then this next fight against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., even though I was not thoroughly impressed with Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., really throughout his career. And I believe this was even after he got knocked out by Andre Fonfara, that one. Is he Polish? I can't remember what Fonfara is. I can't remember. But, this even happened after Julio Cesar Chavez was knocked out, I believe, at 168 pounds. It was either at 168 or 175. I can't remember. But either way, I think him and Canelo, was this a middleweight fight? Or can't remember if it was a middleweight fight or not. I don't know. But anyways, when it comes down to it, Canelo ends up fighting him. And this was big on pay-per-view because him and Julio Cesar Chavez, both Mexican fighters, that's going to attract a lot of attention. Julio Cesar Chavez, he's been trying to get out of this slump of, not being looked at as a great boxer and a certain amount of other things. And he's always kind of living in his father's shadow. So I remember this fight, man, and I thought, well, Chavez to me isn't the greatest fighter, but this guy has a decent size advantage. He might, have a real chance against Canelo Alvarez. We'll just have to see what happens. And, it came down to it, and, man, Chavez Jr. got his ass completely whooped in this fight. And, looking at it now, we probably know that Chavez Jr. is not that great of a fighter. But when it comes down to it, Chavez was actually on a pretty decent run before he had his loss to Sergio Martinez and a couple of other fighters. So it's not like he was the worst fighter around. And I did not expect at the time Canelo to dominate him the way that he did. He won every single round on the card. I didn't think Chavez Jr. really threw enough, but Chavez has never really been in a great skilled fighter. He kind of leans into you and he kind of prays to land some punches. So it is what it is. He's not really that elite of a defensive fighter either. So Canelo was basically able to whoop him in this fight. This was really, and I seen him evolving slowly a little bit as a fighter, but this was really the first fight when I was like, wow, Canelo looked really, really good in this fight. And one of the things that I had said about Canelo Alvarez prior is that people should try to go to the body of Canelo because Canelo does not have an elite gas tank. And I think he still might have a little bit of a problem with that today. But when it comes down to it, one thing that you notice about Canelo compared to today from many years ago is that he really has learned how to pace himself. And that's what a great boxer does over time. They learn how to pace themselves and they know when to throw. Because if you notice about Canelo Alvarez, he doesn't really, I'm not saying that he doesn't throw combinations at certain times, but he's not really a person that, will throw a bunch of those combinations up against the ropes anymore. He's kind of more of a 1-2, 1-2-3 kind of guy now. I've seen that happen ever since this Chavez Jr. fight, and I thought he looked really impressive in this fight, man. So finally, I believe Gennady Golovkin comes in the ring, and this big, huge fight is announced. Gennady Golovkin versus Canelo Alvarez, basically Clash of the Titans. Canelo Alvarez has that, speech, we're Mexicans, we don't fuck around, all that stuff. And this is a big, huge fight, but I'm looking at it. I'm still not overtly impressed with Canelo. I thought that he kind of got off easy by facing, some fighters that weren't necessarily on the Gennady Golovkin level. And Gennady Golovkin at the time was ranked like top 3 pound for pound. So this first fight happens, and I'm expecting Gennady Golovkin to just knock his head off. I'm expecting Gennady Golovkin to really knock this dude out. And Canelo Alvarez, he gave Gennady Golovkin a little bit of problems within the first couple of rounds. But then after that second round, Golovkin was able to really start to get to him. He was landing his jab. He was landing some body shots. But one thing I noticed about Golovkin is that he kept trying to go for like an overhand right, but Canelo was avoiding it pretty decently well. He wasn't just running into that shot. Golovkin kept trying to land it over and over again. And one thing I also noticed is that Golovkin, just like many other fighters, even though he landed body shots here and there, he wasn't trying to go to the body, a decent amount of the time. And I'm like, man, why is that? But now looking at it today, it might be because of Canelo Alvarez's counterpunching ability. But when it comes down to it, the middle rounds I thought completely went to Golovkin. And then you had the last 3 rounds. And I thought that it was pretty competitive. But at the end of this fight, because there's not really much to report in this fight, I thought Golovkin, and I still stand by this, and I know I'm not the only one that would think this, I think Golovkin won the first fight, and I thought he won it clearly. But after what I seen in the Lara fight, after what I seen in a couple of the other fights that Canelo Alvarez had been in, and a certain amount of people did not believe me when I said that Canelo sometimes gets, iffy scorecards, a certain amount of people finally believed me when it came to the Gennady Golovkin fight. And I said, I told you guys, Canelo Alvarez, unless you knock him out, you're not going to win that fight against him. And I remember it being a draw. And I remember hearing that 10 rounds to 2 scorecard by Adelaide Bird. And I'm like, man, are you serious? Like, come on. That, that might even be worse than the 9 rounds to 3 scorecard for Canelo Alvarez against Arizona Lara. That might even be worse when it comes down to it. And, the LDBC and new media, if you watch their channels, they've tried very hard to tear down Gennady Golovkin as a hype job. Gennady Golovkin's not a hype job. Now, you can say, and let me tell you something, I criticized Gennady Golovkin a certain amount of times as well because he did not want to face Arizona Lara and he did not want to face Andre Ward. So that is something I usually criticize Gennady Golovkin for. I was not completely criticism free of Gennady Golovkin at the time. Okay, so I was not just completely on Gennady Golovkin's side, but I did think that he was the best middleweight in the world. But when it came down to it, I thought, Golovkin still was a real deal fighter. I think he's pretty much done at this point in time in his career, but Gennady Golovkin was a real deal fighter at this point in time in his career. He was smushing everyone in the middleweight division, man. I'm not going to say that a lot of these guys were A-class fighters, but they were decent fighters, and he made them look like amateurs. He was just smushing them. He was absolutely stomping all over them, and I thought he won the first Canelo Alvarez fight, and I'm like, man, I don't think Canelo Alvarez won that fight. So, of course, they had that rematch. Canelo Alvarez gets caught on steroids. Of course, I believe it was called clenbuterol, at the time. And, of course, his Mexican fan base made an excuse. No, Canelo Alvarez did take steroids. I believe that full-heartedly. Yes, he did take steroids. It is what it is. Is he possibly still on steroids today? Possibly, but I can't say that without a shadow of a doubt because he hasn't gotten caught ever since, the lead up to the Gennady Golovkin rematch, so I can't necessarily say that, but it is what it is. But when it comes down to it overall, I remember the rematch happening, and I actually predicted Canelo Alvarez to win the rematch. And the reason why I predicted him to win the rematch is because what I saw in that fight, and I think it's the same thing that Canelo Alvarez saw, is that his power, even though it is very great, is not going to knock out Canelo Alvarez with just one shot, most likely. And Canelo Alvarez said, okay, well, you know what? I think the best way to fight this guy is to push him backwards. And overall, to kind of put him in a little bit of an awkward position. And that was the best thing to do because even though I don't think Gennady Golovkin is nearly as bad on the back foot as many people like to allege, it was going to be very dangerous for him in a Canelo Alvarez fight because Canelo was faster than him. I think they're both excellent counterpunchers for their day, but Canelo has a little bit more in that setup. He is a better combination puncher than Gennady Golovkin. He was faster than Gennady Golovkin, and maybe you can argue, better movement than Gennady Golovkin for the time. I would argue that he does have better movement, and I've never been overly impressed with Canelo Alvarez's movement throughout this time at least, but he seemed to have better movement. Overall, he just seemed to be the more skilled fighter, not by a great deal, but good enough. And I thought the first half of the fight, Canelo Alvarez was winning. But of course, I still did not like, Canelo Alvarez at this time when it came down to it. And, at the end of the fight, even though Canelo, I did think won the first half of the fight and maybe won even a couple rounds after that, I said, well, that was a bad decision. I thought Canelo Alvarez won that fight. I think that Canelo Alvarez, got another robbery decision and all sort of stuff. And, I was in a little bit denial of that fight, but rewatching it today, I do think that Canelo Alvarez won that rematch, and that is something overall that I think is really, you can debate that that's the biggest win of his career. Gennady Golovkin was no joke. Gennady Golovkin was an A-plus fighter. He was a top 3 pound-for-pound fighter. He was someone that was completely wrecking the middleweight divisions. He certainly was someone who was attracting a lot of attention. That is debatably the biggest win of Canelo Alvarez's career. That second match against Gennady Golovkin. And this is when, when I kind of got out of that denial phase and I really started to respect Canelo Alvarez's game. And I said, okay, you know what? This guy really is the real deal. He really is the real deal. And I started, looking at Canelo Alvarez overall in a different light. And I said, okay, you know what? Because when I rewatched it, I said, he does look pretty good. He does look pretty good. I think he's evolved as a fighter. He obviously can handle the big fights because at one point in time when he started going into the middleweight division, I thought there was a possibility that he was not even going to be able to beat David Lemieux. So it is what it is. But when it comes down to it, when he beat Gennady Golovkin in that rematch, I said, okay, he's the real deal fighter. Now, in my opinion, I still think Canelo Alvarez lost the first fight. But it is what it is. He showed up in the rematch and he beat Gennady Golovkin in the rematch. So he deserves a lot of credit for that. So then comes this next fight against Rocky Fielding. And I was not overly impressed with Rocky Fielding at all. I really had no idea who this guy was. And then I looked up highlights of him. Once again, looked like another one of those British, straightforward British fighters that really didn't have a great amount of talent. And once again, there are some great British fighters out there. Britain comes out with some great fighters. But there's also a lot of Britain fighters that to me just look average, when it comes down. And Rocky Fielding was one of those fighters. I just was not overly impressed with him. And I said, I think Canelo Alvarez is going to smoke this dude within 3 rounds. And what do you know? What happened? He smoked him exactly within 3 rounds. And that's exactly what happened. So I thought that was, kind of hilarious. But when it came down to it, he completely he just beat Rocky Fielding's ass, man. He beat him in the next week. I think he eventually, I don't remember if he knocked him down, that last knockdown with a headshot or a body shot. I thought it was a body shot, but he completely tarnished him. And was that for a belt? I can't. Yeah, one WBA regular super middleweight title. Yeah, I think. Yeah, that was for a belt. That might have even been Canelo Alvarez's first official super middleweight fight. I can't remember, but he looked pretty decently impressive in that fight. And this is when Canelo Alvarez, once again, after that Gennady Golovkin rematch, he finally has my respect when it comes down to it. So I say, okay, he really, is one of the top fighters, even though I didn't think Rocky Fielding was that impressive of an opponent. But then this next fight against Danny Jacobs, and if you know Danny Jacobs is a pretty damn decent fighter. He gave Gennady Golovkin a tough fight, and let me also say this, because a certain amount of the Gennady Golovkin haters, especially new media and LDBC, they try to they try to spread this bullshit around that Danny Jacobs got robbed against Gennady Golovkin. No, he didn't. Danny Jacobs did not get robbed against Gennady Golovkin. He didn't get robbed against Canelo Alvarez. It is what it is, because I used to have the same opinion about Danny Jacobs versus Gennady Golovkin, but when you actually take a look at that fight thoroughly, Gennady Golovkin clearly won that fight, probably around 7 rounds to 5. So it was a close fight, but Gennady Golovkin clearly won that fight. It is what it is. But anyway, so he fights Danny Jacobs, and at this point, man, once upon a time, that would have been a 50-50 fight, but I'm taking a look at this fight. I think it's about 70-30 at least, which is interesting. Some of you might even predicted that it was going to be 60-40. But I think Canelo Alvarez, when I just take a look at him, I think that he's decently powerful. I think that he's got enough defensive prowess. And when I take a look at Danny Jacobs, he's just, and let me also say this, because the LDBC and new media, they were spreading around this narrative, and they still spread around this narrative today. Oh, Canelo, he fought Danny Jacobs when he didn't look that impressive against Sergey Derevyanchenko. Well, first of all, Sergey Derevyanchenko, I'm not going to say that he's, a great fighter, but he's not a bad fighter. He's given some of those guys very tough fights. He gave Gennady Golovkin, even though, let's be real, Gennady Golovkin really hasn't been the same fighter ever since the Canelo Alvarez rematch. But when it comes down to the overall, Sergey Derevyanchenko is not a bad fighter. He's probably a solid B-class fighter. So when it comes down to, he gave Danny Jacobs a tough fight, but it's not like that fight was 7 rounds to 5 or anything like that. It's not like Danny Jacobs escaped with his life, barely, or was clinging on barely in that fight. He won that fight clearly, in my opinion, 8 rounds to 4. But the thing is about Danny Jacobs, Danny Jacobs has never really looked overly impressive when you take a look at his certain fights. I mean, even when he was going to go and fight Gennady Golovkin, Danny Jacobs wasn't looking overtly impressive against a lot of these opponents. The most impressive performance of Danny Jacobs' career still remains that Peter Quillen win that he had, that first-round knockout, I believe, that he had, which at the time was looked at as a 50-50 fight, but Danny Jacobs ended up knocking him out in round 1, I believe, which was a very big surprise to me at that time, but to everyone, I think. But when it comes down to the overall, Danny Jacobs had never really looked overly impressive. I mean, just take a look at his first fight against Sergio Mora. He got knocked down in that fight. A guy that punches like, a paper bag. It is what it is. Danny Jacobs has never been overly impressive. So, and on top of that, looking at him, Danny Jacobs has always looked a little bit sloppy. He's not really extremely slick. I'm not saying that he does not have, some slick ability, but he's not an A-class slick fighter. It is what it is. But one thing about Danny is that he does have a great power. He's got decent speed. He's got decent strength. He's a very good athlete. And he's not the worst boxer in the world. He doesn't have an A-class skill set. So I thought, okay, well, this is a very decent fight. Danny Jacobs is a pretty damn good fight when it comes down to it. And, Danny Jacobs, you can argue, is an A-class fighter. But when it comes down to it, I remember seeing this fight. This is still one of the most impressive performances that I've seen by Canelo Alvarez to this day, because I just don't remember Canelo Alvarez really getting hit in this fight. This is one of those fights against one of those bigger name fighters where I thought, wow, Canelo Alvarez really is just not getting hit a whole lot in this fight, man. Danny just really can't hit him. And that's somewhat along the lines of what I predicted, because once again, Danny is a little bit sloppy than what some people like to admit. But when it comes down to it, I was very impressed with him in this fight. And I thought Canelo Alvarez won this fight probably about 7 rounds to 5, 8 rounds to 4. I'd have to really rewatch it. But Canelo also had a little bit of stamina issues in this fight, you could tell. Maybe Danny Jacobs' power was starting to get to him a little bit. Maybe, Canelo just did not conserve himself as well as he should have. I don't know. But, it is what it is. But I thought Canelo Alvarez clearly won this fight. You certainly cannot claim that this was a robbery. And he beat Danny Jacobs pretty much at the best point in his career. Let's not let's not spread these narratives around like the LDBC and new media love to do. He only fought Danny when Danny was coming off of an unimpressive performance. Danny has never really been overtly impressive in his career. All right, so it is what it is. Even before he fought Golovkin and Peter Quillen, he suffered a knockout loss to Dmitry Pirog. He's never been this A-skilled class fighter. Now, he is an A-grade fighter, in my opinion, but that doesn't always mean that you have an A-grade skill set. It is what it is. Danny Jacobs has never been this overtly impressive fighter. It is what it is. But, that's the bottom line. So, that's when Canelo overall, fought Danny Jacobs. Thought it was a very great fight by him. Did he win a belt in that one? One IBF middleweight title. Okay, cool. Nice. Okay. So he fought Danny Jacobs. So this next fight against Sergey Kovalev. This was a very interesting fight. And, Sergey Kovalev used to be one of the top 3 pound-for-pound fighters in the world. Now, I don't think Sergey Kovalev was necessarily the same fighter that he had used to be in this fight. Obviously, I don't think that he was the same fighter that he was when he fought Andre Ward in this fight against Canelo Alvarez. But this was a 60-40 fight. I predicted Canelo Alvarez to beat Sergey Kovalev, but when it came down to it, I knew that it was going to be a decent fight. I knew that Sergey Kovalev would have more of a chance than what people thought, because Canelo Alvarez had really never fought a light heavyweight before, and Sergey Kovalev, I believe he had a middleweight title here. He had the WBO light heavyweight title. The LDBC and new media, once again, they try to tear down Canelo Alvarez. And they love to say, well, Sergey Kovalev, he wasn't anywhere near the same fighter. Well, he wasn't the same fighter that he was, of course, when he fought Andre Ward. But Sergey Kovalev was still a very decent fighter in his career. He was one of the top light heavyweights in the world at the time. He had recently defeated Eleider Alvarez, who was one of the top contenders at the time there. He dominated him in the rematch, and he dominated an undefeated British fighter by the name of Anthony Yarde. When it came down to it, he knocked him out. So Sergey Kovalev, let's not sit here and pretend, because we all know what the LDBC and new media would be saying if it were Jamal Charlo or Demetrius Andre defeating that version of Sergey Kovalev. We all know what they would be saying. They'd be relishing them with praise, but it is what it is. But I knew this fight was going to be tough, and I remember Sergey Kovalev in this fight. He was using his jab pretty well, and I always say with Canelo Alvarez that if you want to beat him, try to use your jab, because Canelo does not avoid jabs extremely well. It is what it is. Sergey Kovalev was using his jab pretty well, but and a certain amount of people alleged that this fight was fixed. Do I believe it was fixed? No, I don't believe it was fixed at all. Because a certain amount of people say Sergey Kovalev wasn't throwing enough. He wasn't, throwing a certain amount of these punches. I mean, who does that? Sergey Kovalev wasn't throwing his right hand. He wasn't throwing a certain amount of punches, because if you notice in that fight, Canelo Alvarez was trying to counter him. He was trying to counter him with a left to the body or a left to the head. That's what he was trying to do. So Sergey Kovalev felt the power early on, and eventually he said, well, I can't take this dude's power. And Sergey Kovalev at this point in time, he just did not have a great amount of, what's the word that I'm looking for? Punch resistance. He did not really have a great amount of punch resistance. So it is what it is, But at that time, I remember it being a decently close fight. The scorecards, predictably, in the Canelo Alvarez fight were farther apart than what they probably should have been, but it is what it is. I still thought Canelo Alvarez was winning the fight. And of course, what new media and what the LDBC tried to do, they tried to say, well, can you believe that Sergey Kovalev pretty much washed up in his career, and Canelo Alvarez overall, he still barely won that fight. Sergey Kovalev is a still very decent fighter, even at this point in time in his career. So let's not discredit Canelo Alvarez for this. Once again, is this the same win over Sergey Kovalev that Andre Ward had? Obviously not. But when it comes down to it, it was still a very decent win. So let's not, discredit him. But of course, that's what the LDBC and new media does. So it is what it is. And let me explain what they do, because a certain amount of people are not going to agree with this. They want a black fighter to be the number 1 pound for pound. That's what they want. Because what you notice about them is that they won't go after those fighters, or at least new media. They won't go after those fighters unless they're threatening the number 1 pound for pound spot. That's why they had such a problem with Vasyl Lomachenko, and they had such a problem with Canelo Alvarez, and they're trying to tear down their names constantly. Okay? They want Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence to be the number 1 pound for pound fighter. And let me tell you something. If Terrence beats Manny Pacquiao next, like I said, he'll certainly be in that conversation. It is what it is. But right now, I have both Errol Spence and Canelo Alvarez over Terrence Crawford. Right now, I have Canelo as the number one pound for pound fighter. So it is what it is, and I'm not the only one. So it's whatever. But anyways, I remember Canelo Alvarez knocking out Sergey Kovalev. I remember him hitting Sergey Kovalev with that left hand. Sergey getting stunned by it, and then he gets hit with that very good right, and he's pretty much out cold. So it is what it is. Very decent fight, but the fight pretty much went down how I thought it was going to go. I thought Canelo was going to knock him out, later on. And I was right about that. Canelo looked pretty decent in the fight. Was it a decently tough fight, decently close fight? Yeah, of course. But when it comes down to it, that was to be expected. Once again, new media and the LDBC, they tried to say that, this isn't a close fight at all. This isn't a great fight. He's avoiding, decent fighters. Like, oh, let me tell you something, man. That version of Sergey Kovalev is probably going to give a tougher fight to Canelo Alvarez than Jamal Charlo, Demetrius Andrade, or David Benavidez as well. And a certain amount of people may disagree with me on that. I just don't see these fighters giving Canelo Alvarez that much of a challenge. And a certain amount of people may disagree. Let me tell you something. I don't think that David Benavidez, Jamal Charlo, Demetrius Andrade, I don't think any of those fighters could have beat that version of Sergey Kovalev. And a certain amount of people may disagree, or Billy Joe Saunders, or whoever else you want to bring up. It is what it is. Anyway, so Canelo Alvarez deserves a certain amount of credit for that fight. Once again, is it the same win that Andre Ward had over Sergey Kovalev? No, of course not, but it's still a very decent version of him. Let's not sit here and act like Sergey Kovalev was not beating top contenders. Let's not sit here and act like it was when Terrence Crawford was fighting Kell Brook, when Kell Brook was a completely washed-up fighter. But you notice they won't say that about Terrence Crawford, right? They won't. New media won't say that about Terrence Crawford. They won't say that Terrence Crawford fought a completely washed-up version of Kell Brook that was Errol Spence's and Gennady Golovkin's leftovers. They won't say that. But it is what it is. Anyway. So then his next fight comes against Callum Smith. And this, of course, obviously did not happen too long ago. I did a prediction video on this, and I'm sure, for a certain amount of my older viewers, they've seen this. I thought Callum Smith had a legit chance in this fight. And Callum Smith, I believe, is is he the younger brother of Liam Smith? I can't remember. But I believe they're brothers, and I think Callum Smith is about 10 times more talented than Liam Smith, to be honest with you. I've never been overly impressed with Liam Smith. Thought he was a very one-dimensional fighter. Callum Smith, I see faults in his style, but I at least see a chance where he possibly could beat Canelo Alvarez. And Canelo Alvarez is so defensively sound in this fight. He looks very powerful in this fight. He's able to completely march forward and really beat the shit out of Callum Smith. He really beats the hell out of him when it comes down to it. And I was so thoroughly impressed with Canelo Alvarez in this fight. I thought that he looked very great in this fight. I thought he was fantastic. And Callum Smith is one of the top super middleweights in the world. He was even ranked number 1 by some of the boxing sites out there. So this, in my opinion, you could debate was an A-grade win. If not an A-grade win, then a B-grade win at least. Now, there are some debates. Are David Benavidez and Caleb Plant more talented than a Callum Smith, or are they better? You can debate that, but I don't know if I can say that without a doubt. Is David Benavidez going to beat a Callum Smith? Who knows? I'm not necessarily sure, because David Benavidez is very hittable. When you take a look at Caleb Plant, now Caleb Plant, in my opinion, when I take a look at the 168-pound division, that is the fighter that might give Canelo Alvarez the most amount of problems out of the 168-pound division, in my opinion, because he moves very slick. He's a very good boxer. Could be a little bit more defensively sound, but when it comes down to that might be the boxer that gives Canelo Alvarez the most problems at 168 pounds. That guy right there, because I think he beats probably both Callum Smith and David Benavidez. I think he's very decently slick. He ended up being a little bit better than I eventually thought he would be, but it is what it is. So I'm very impressed with Canelo Alvarez in this fight. That is debatably the best I've ever seen Canelo Alvarez look against a pretty decently elite fighter. That, to me, that's a very good fight. A certain amount of people, of course, they're going to debate that that's not an elite win. In my opinion, that's an elite win. Of course, the LDBC and new media, they're going to say that was not a great win. Once again, had Jamal Charlo, had, overall Demetrius Andrade defeated, a Callum Smith, an undefeated Callum Smith, they would have been ranting and raving about him. It is what it is. I don't even think that Jamal Charlo or Demetrius Andrade certainly doesn't have a win in his career like a Callum Smith win. But even Jamal Charlo, you can debate that there's no win that Jamal Charlo has in his career that's like a win, over Callum Smith. Callum Smith on some lists was ranked as the number 1 super middleweight in the world. Now maybe you can debate that J-Rock, Julian Williams was a greater win, maybe, but Julian Williams has lost some fights that he should have not lost, man. Like that one, guy recently that just knocked him out, but I can't remember. It is what it is. Anyway, but that was a very thorough performance by Canelo Alvarez. I thought he looked perfect in that fight. I thought he looked fantastic. He was so accurate. He was so great. And Callum Smith, even though he's a pretty decent fighter, Callum Smith very clearly, he just didn't have the skill set to deal with Canelo Alvarez. So it is what it is. But anyways, that leads us to the next fight, the last fight that happens. And, this is against Avni Yildirim, or whatever his name is, Turkish fighter. But when it comes down to it, I remember there was a UFC card happening that day as well. So I don't think I watched this fight, much of it. And by the time I got on there, the fight was actually already over. So I was like, damn, I missed it. But I remember watching the replay, and Canelo Alvarez, he ended up dropping him, I believe, in the third round and basically beating the tar out of him in the third round. And, the Joel Diaz and the corner, I think they eventually stopped it, right after that third round happened. So that fight didn't last very long. And that, in my opinion, is not really a very elite opponent, but it is what it is. But that pretty much, sums up the career review of Canelo Alvarez for today. I think that, I think he's become a very elite fighter. I used to hate Canelo Alvarez. I used to absolutely hate him. I used to think that at one point in time, he was not even a top 10 pound for pound fighter. And this was after his Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Araceli Lara fights. So, I used to not like Canelo Alvarez at all. But he's now one of my favorites to watch. I think Canelo Alvarez has become an all-time great boxer. And this next fight against Billy Joe Saunders, in my opinion, is an A-grade fight. I've had a certain amount of people tell me that Billy Joe Saunders doesn't bring much to the table. I disagree. I think he brings a certain amount to the table. He's extremely talented. Billy Joe Saunders is a great fighter. He's undefeated. He's won belts in 2 separate weight classes. This is no joke, man. Billy Joe Saunders is no joke. And I've had certain people tell me that Billy Joe Saunders is probably going to try to do the same things that Lara and Mayweather did, but that he's not as good as them. Well, obviously, he's probably not as good as Mayweather, but he might be on that same level as Lara, and a certain amount of people might disagree. Now, Lara is extremely accurate, expert counterpuncher, extremely great defensively, but one fault with Lara is that sometimes he could throw a little bit more. I think Billy Joe Saunders, at his best, you can debate, is on maybe that same level with Lara. Maybe. But we'll have to see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. I just thought that I would give y'all my career review of Saul Canelo Alvarez. Thank you all so much for watching. I just think that it would make for a very interesting video. That's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully y'all had a great time with it. And once again, if you guys have any recommendations of who you would want me to do next, I have no problem with that, and I'll try to do my best on it. But anyways, that's really about it for today. That's my career review on Saul Canelo Alvarez. I'm very excited for his fight next month on May 8th. Against Billy Joe Saunders, and I can't wait, man. I can't wait. But anyways, that's really about it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.